The wind howls through an endless white wilderness. Snow drifts across the frozen plains, swallowing the horizon in silence. Somewhere beneath that silence, a faint orange flicker breaks through the cold. Fire. Not in a modern fireplace, but in a small, smoke-filled shelter made of bones, hides, and determination. Thousands of years before the first bricks, before cities, before even the idea of architecture, humans learned to engineer warmth. They faced 30-degree C winters with no technology, no comfort, no certainty. And yet they thrived. This is the untold story of how our ancestors built the first homes, not just structures of survival, but living symbols of intelligence, cooperation, and the human spark that refused to die, even when the world froze over. The world was changing, and the change was merciless. Ice crept across continents like a slow tide, swallowing forests, mountains, and valleys in its frozen grip. The skies dulled to a constant gray, and sunlight became a faint memory. A rumor passed between generations who had forgotten what warmth truly felt like. The wind carried the sound of emptiness, and beneath it the earth slept under miles of snow. Welcome to Before Flame. If you enjoyed traveling back in time with me, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you never miss the next journey into our ancient past. For the first humans, this was not an era of comfort, but a test of endurance. Every day was a negotiation between life and extinction. The air was dry, the land barren, and food scarce. Mammoths roamed the icy plains, their massive frames swaying through blizzards that could blind in minutes. Saber-toothed cats stalked from shadows, and early humans, small, fragile, unarmed, watched, learned, and waited. They were not the strongest species, nor the fastest, but they had something else entirely, an unyielding hunger to understand. Generations before them had lived freely under open skies, following herds across green savannas. But now the land had transformed into a white desert. The rivers that once gave life were now thick with ice. Firewood was rare, and warmth came only from huddling together, from the shared breath of survival. Families clung to one another inside makeshift shelters carved into earth and stone, hoping each sunrise would not be their last. The Ice Age wasn't a sudden storm. It was a slow, creeping silence. Glaciers advanced inch by inch, year after year, until they covered nearly a third of the planet. Even the air carried the weight of the cold. To breathe was to inhale frost. To live was to resist it. The horizon offered no promise, only the pale glow of endless snow. Yet somehow amidst this desolation, a spark of human defiance endured. What separated these early humans from the countless creatures that vanished into the frost wasn't just instinct, it was imagination. They didn't just run from the cold, they tried to understand it. They began noticing patterns in the seasons, the migrations, the behavior of animals before storms. Each discovery, however small, was a thread in a growing web of knowledge that would eventually reshape their fate. The world may have frozen, but the human mind was just beginning to awaken. The cold was no longer just an enemy, it had become a teacher. Every sound in this frozen world carried meaning. The crack of ice beneath a mammoth's foot told of shifting ground. The sudden stillness of birds signaled a coming storm. Humans began to listen, not with fear but with intention. Survival meant more than endurance now. It meant understanding the rhythm of the land that sought to erase them. They learned the texture of snow, how one layer could trap warmth, while another warned of collapse. They studied the way frost formed on branches, how certain shapes meant wind from the north, harsher and deadly. The Ice Age was a cruel instructor, but its lessons were precise. And those who paid attention lived longer than those who didn't. Small groups began to migrate south, chasing the fragile warmth of the sun. But warmth was a mirage. Even there, the chill followed. In this constant movement, humans grew restless and inventive. They began experimenting with what little the land offered: stones, hides, bones. From these fragments, they built the beginnings of civilization's first tools. A broken shard of flint became a blade sharp enough to cut through frozen meat. A hollowed bone turned into a vessel for carrying precious drops of melted snow. But perhaps their greatest innovation came not from their hands, but from their minds. They discovered something profound, that survival improved when they worked together. The lone wanderer froze, but the tribe endured. Around shared fires they exchanged discoveries, passing knowledge like an inheritance. Fire-making once a rare miracle sparked by lightning, became an art mastered through patience. Two stones struck together could create light from darkness, warmth from despair. Each new spark wasn't just fire, it was progress. With it they learned to cook, to defend, to gather around a common heart of heat. The fire turned caves into homes and homes into communities. It changed how they saw each other. The cold outside no longer defined them. Their warmth did. Yet with every gain came new questions. How long could they stay before the glaciers pushed further? What lay beyond the white horizon? The Ice Age gave no answers, only silence, but in that silence humans began to dream. They started to imagine not just how to survive, but how to thrive. The world around them was merciless, but the fire within them was unrelenting. The first true winter of memory came without mercy. Winds howled like living creatures, dragging curtains of snow across the land. Days and nights became indistinguishable, both dim, both endless. Yet inside a shallow cave on the edge of a frozen valley, a small group of humans huddled around a flickering flame that refused to die. That flame was more than heat. It was hope, knowledge and power condensed into a trembling light. They had learned to feed it carefully, to guard it against the hunger of the wind. Dry moss, bone marrow, resin scraped from pine, these became the ingredients of survival. Fire demanded care and patience, but in return, it offered transformation. Around it, they began to build not just warmth, but meaning. The circle of light became a world within a world, separating safety from chaos, belonging from isolation. The firelight changed how they saw themselves. Shadows on cave walls turned into stories, stories into memory, and memory into identity. What began as simple survival became ritual. Each night, they gathered not merely to endure the cold, but to remind themselves who they were. They learned that warmth was not only a physical state, it was something shared, something built between people. Outside, the storm raged for days. Inside, the group began to plan. They mapped the land from memory, tracing the rivers that froze last, the cliffs that shielded from the wind, the places where mammoths crossed. Thought turned into foresight. Knowledge became strategy. For the first time, humans were not just reacting to the world, they were shaping their response to it. When the storm finally broke, the world outside had changed again. Snowdrifts swallowed paths. The sun returned briefly, weak but golden. They emerged from their cave not as wanderers, but as architects of their own fate. The Ice Age was no longer just an age of cold. It had become the forge in which the human spirit was tempered. Every frozen dawn after that carried the echo of that first flame. The moment when humankind learned to challenge nature, not with strength, but with understanding. It was the beginning of something extraordinary. A species learning to build comfort in a world designed for hardship. The frost would grow harsher in the centuries ahead, but so would their imagination. The fire had given them warmth, but it could not move with them. It flickered and died when the wind howled too hard, or when they were forced to travel in search of food. That was when humans began to dream of something more permanent, a place where the cold could not reach them. The birth of shelter began not with wood or stone, but with an idea. What if warmth could be trapped? At first, they built with instinct. Fallen branches leaned together against the side of a rock, hides draped over them to block the wind. These crude forms offered little more than a pause from the storm. But with each failure came learning. They began to notice that smaller spaces stayed warmer, that the earth itself could protect better than air. Gradually they turned to the ground, digging into slopes, carving hollows in frozen soil, shaping the land into a shield. The first true shelters were not separate from nature. They were part of it. Mammoth bones became arches, layers of earth became walls. Snow itself became insulation. They learned that the same substance that froze them could, if shaped correctly, protect them. They began arranging bones in circular frames, weaving animal sinew and branches between them, and covering the structure with thick hides. These were not mere huts, they were experiments in survival. Every new structure carried the memory of trial and error. One family discovered that if they built the entrance facing away from the prevailing wind, the cold air stayed out longer. Another learned that placing heated stones inside the shelter released warmth for hours after the fire died. Slowly, an entire science began to form, a kind of prehistoric architecture rooted in necessity and refined through wisdom. The shelters became more than protection. They became homes, a concept new to the human story. Within these small round spaces, warmth gathered not just in the air but in hearts. The walls were thin, but inside them grew something indestructible, the sense of belonging. And so, while the Ice Age pressed harder with each passing year, humans began to carve small pockets of defiance into its frozen heart. Where once they only huddled beneath open skies, they now shaped worlds of their own making, worlds where warmth was no longer a fleeting accident, but a creation of their will. Every structure began as an act of imagination. When humans looked at a bare landscape of ice and bones, they no longer saw desolation, they saw material. The curved ribs of a mammoth could become the skeleton of a home. Layers of earth could turn into natural insulation. Even the direction of the wind could be studied, anticipated, and used. Shelter building became not just survival, but innovation, the first quiet revolution of the human mind. They started to test the limits of what their environment could give. Those living in wide plains learned to anchor hides with mammoth tusks, bending them to form domes that resisted the wind's rage. In the northern forests, where wood was scarce, they stacked sod, moss, and stone into layered defenses against the cold. Each tribe adapted differently, but the goal was always the same: to trap warmth, to hold on to comfort just a little longer. The shelters themselves began to teach. When a roof collapsed under snow, they learned to curve it. When smoke filled the air and burned their lungs, they carved small openings that released it. These adjustments, born from failure, became principles. Over time, entire regions developed distinct architectural wisdom passed down through gestures and memory. There were no drawings, no words, just patterns carved into minds. What they built was far more advanced than it appeared. The dome shape, used across thousands of miles by unrelated tribes, was not coincidence. It was discovery. Rounded walls trapped heat efficiently and allowed wind to pass around rather than through. Entrances were built low and narrow to keep warm air from escaping. Double layers of hides created insulation chambers that mimicked the fur of the animals they wore. Without knowing it, they had invented thermodynamics in practice. At night, as firelight painted the inside of those shelters, families gathered in warmth so profound that the storm outside became background noise. It was no longer just about surviving nature. It was about mastering it. In those dim circles of warmth, humans began to feel something entirely new: control. The Ice Age was still vast, still merciless, but for the first time, it could not reach them everywhere. These shelters became sanctuaries of the human spirit, places where thought could stretch beyond the next meal or the next sunrise. Around those fires, dreams began to take form, not of escaping the cold, but of shaping the world so it could no longer dictate the terms of their existence. Inside those domed sanctuaries, something extraordinary began to unfold. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and fur, the soft crackle of fire echoing off curved walls. These spaces were more than shelters now. They were laboratories of human thought. Every generation built upon the knowledge of the last, turning the act of survival into a legacy of design, adaptation, and insight. They began experimenting with placement. Fire pits were no longer random circles of stone, but carefully chosen centers of heat circulation. Stones arranged around them absorbed warmth during the day and released it slowly through the night. When a draft crept in, they lined the floor with animal skins and moss, creating natural insulation. Slowly, unknowingly, they were crafting principles that architects thousands of years later would still follow. The Ice Age had forced them into the harshest conditions imaginable, but that same brutality awakened a kind of brilliance. Their shelters became lessons in physics and empathy, how air moved, how warmth behaved, how space shaped emotion. The circular layout meant no one sat apart. Every person could feel the same heat, share the same stories. Around that circle, equality was born. It was not just architecture that evolved, it was culture. Children grew up watching, learning how to build by touch, by memory. A mother teaching her son how to tighten a hide over a bone frame was not only passing on skill, but a story. The story of how their people had outwitted the cold. Knowledge in this world was warmth itself. Those who shared it ensured the survival of others. And that sharing became the thread that connected tribes across distances of frozen emptiness. Even art emerged from these sanctuaries. The walls of caves, blackened by soot and lit by flickering firelight, became canvases. They painted the animals they hunted, the patterns of the wind, the shape of their homes. These drawings weren't decoration. They were diagrams, symbols, instructions. They were blueprints of memory. In time, the line between survival and creation vanished. Every act of building was an act of expression. Every flame inside a shelter was a declaration that they would not bow to the elements. The cold outside could silence the forests and freeze the rivers, but inside those handmade worlds, life pulsed steadily. And in that heartbeat of warmth, humanity found something more profound than survival, the first whisper of civilization. The Ice Age did not just test them. It taught them how to become more than animals. It taught them how to create comfort, meaning and belonging from nothing but will. The shelters stood as proof. Even in a world made of ice, the human spirit could build fire. Shelter and fire had given humanity its footing, but the Ice Age had one more lesson to teach. That warmth was not just something found, but something worn. As the world grew colder, the hunt for survival turned inward. The air outside could pierce through skin like glass, freezing fingers before they could strike a spark. Humans realized that to endure this endless winter, they would need to carry warmth with them, not in their hands, but on their bodies. At first, it was instinct. They wrapped themselves in animal hides torn straight from the kill, heavy and stiff with blood and frost. The hides kept them alive but trapped movement. To walk, to run, even to breathe beneath them was labor. Over time, a shift occurred. The same shift that had transformed crude shelters into marvels of design. They began to shape their protection. Stones sharpened into needles. Sinew dried into thread. The first stitches in human history were sewn not for beauty, but for survival. They discovered that the fur of certain animals, mammoth, wolf, reindeer, held different kinds of warmth. The dense underfur of smaller creatures could trap air close to the skin, while outer hides resisted snow and wind. Layer by layer, they built a new kind of armor, a soft base to cradle the skin, a thick middle for insulation, a hardened outer shell for defense against the elements. Without realizing it, they had invented the principles of thermal layering, a technology so precise that it remains unchanged, even in modern cold weather gear. But warmth was more than physics. It was memory. Each hide carried the story of a hunt, the echo of a shared struggle. Clothes were not just garments. They were trophies, tools, and talismans. Wearing them was like carrying the warmth of every victory. A child bundled in fur carried not only protection from the cold, but the legacy of those who had learned, through trial and loss, how to make the impossible livable. As these garments evolved, so did self-awareness. For the first time, humans began to recognize beauty in survival. Patterns were carved into leather, beads of bone and ivory sewn into hems. What had begun as necessity became identity, proof that they were not mere wanderers in a frozen world, but thinkers, creators, designers of their fate. They had learned to make warmth portable, to carry comfort wherever they went. And in doing so, they took their first step toward conquering the Ice Age, not through strength or dominance, but through invention and imagination. The cold still ruled the land, but no longer ruled them. The world outside remained a wilderness of frost and silence, but within the folds of fur and sinew, humans carried a secret warmth that no storm could strip away. Every garment was a masterpiece of observation, the result of thousands of small experiments. They discovered that sewing along certain directions of fur kept wind from cutting through. They learned that animal fat, rubbed along seams, made clothing waterproof. And when garments tore, they didn't discard them. They repaired them layer over layer, until each piece became a patchwork of resilience and memory. These were not mere clothes. They were tools of adaptation. A well-made hide coat could mean the difference between life and death on a hunt. A fur-lined hood could preserve the heat of one's breath during long journeys. The stitching of these garments was often done by the most skilled hands in the tribe, a craft passed down from elder to child, not with words, but with touch and repetition. This was education in its earliest form, the school of survival. Each tribe began to develop its own techniques. In one region, hunters used strips of reindeer sinew that shrank when wet, tightening seams naturally against wind and water. In another, families softened hides with smoke to make them flexible, so they could move freely during migration. Even colors began to carry meaning. Ochres and charcoals rubbed into clothing for both camouflage and ritual. Clothing had become more than protection. It was culture, identity, and communication. The moment humans began tailoring, something subtle but profound changed. For the first time, they shaped the natural world to fit themselves, rather than shaping themselves to fit the world. Every stitch was an act of rebellion against extinction. It was the embodiment of foresight, of learning to plan beyond the next hour, the next storm, the next generation. These garments also changed how they saw one another. A hunter returning draped in layered pelts was not merely a survivor. He was a symbol of wisdom, of mastery over the elements. Children grew up tracing their fingers over seams, learning the story of every scar, every line of thread. To wear such clothing was to wear the knowledge of countless winters endured and overcome. The Ice Age continued its relentless cycle. Freeze, thaw, freeze again. But humanity now walked its frozen fields with confidence. The same wind that once carved death into their faces now brushed against fur and leather like a whisper of surrender. For the first time in history, warmth was not just a condition, it was an invention. Generations passed and the art of warmth became second nature. Children learned to sew before they could speak fluently, their small hands guided by the rhythm of tradition. Every stitch they made was a continuation of a story that had begun long before them. A story not of kings or conquests, but of quiet endurance. The Ice Age did not end quickly, but humanity no longer waited for mercy. They had learned to thrive beneath its weight. What began as crude hides had evolved into refined garments, layered, flexible, and durable. Hunters moved silently across the snow, wrapped in soft furs that blended with the pale horizon. Mothers wrapped infants in triple layers of skin and moss, creating warmth so complete that breath steamed gently from their tiny mouths. Clothing had transformed from necessity into artistry, a form of living technology crafted through touch, intuition, and memory. But perhaps the most extraordinary part of this evolution was not material. It was mental. As humans learned to weave and stitch, they learned something deeper, the concept of transformation. They began to see that nature was not fixed or untouchable. It could be shaped, guided, reimagined. The same mind that learned to turn bones into frames and hides into coats was the same mind that would one day build cities, ships, and machines. The Ice Age had not simply hardened them, it had refined them. Around the fires, people told stories of ancestors who had survived the endless cold, of the clever woman who first pierced hide with bone, of the man who discovered how to soften frozen leather using the fat of the mammoth. These weren't myths. They were the beginnings of science, of knowledge preserved through memory. Each story carried technique, each lesson wrapped in narrative. This was how technology traveled, not in written words but in spoken wisdom, carried from fire to fire across centuries. As the great ice began its slow retreat, the world changed again. Rivers thawed, grass returned, and the herds moved north. But humanity did not return to what it had been before. They carried something the Ice Age had forged, an understanding that creation was survival. Warmth was no longer a gift of the sun. It was the product of intellect, cooperation, and imagination. Even as the glaciers melted, that instinct endured, the need to build comfort where none existed, to make beauty from necessity. Every coat, every home, every invention that followed was an echo of that first spark, that first stitch in the cold. The Ice Age had not broken humanity. It had defined it, and from that frozen silence a new kind of fire was born, not one of flame but of thought. The same fire that would one day light the world. Long after the Ice Age loosened its grip, the memory of it lingered, not in the frost or the bones buried beneath snow, but in us. Every instinct to seek shelter, every desire for warmth, every flicker of curiosity that drives us to create. It all traces back to those first frozen nights when survival was uncertain and humanity's future hung by a thread. In those ancient winters, people didn't just fight the cold. They learned from it. The chill taught them to observe, to plan, to imagine. It showed them the fragility of life and the strength of unity. When they built their homes from bone and hide, they weren't merely seeking comfort. They were shaping the first outlines of civilization. When they stitched furs into garments, they weren't only fighting frostbite. They were creating art, identity, and ingenuity. Each innovation, The shelter, the clothing, the fire was more than a tool. It was a declaration, a message whispered into the storm. We will not vanish, and that message became the core of what it means to be human. From caves to cabins, from stone hearths to glowing cities, the essence of every invention since has been the same. The will to make life a little warmer, a little safer, a little more beautiful. The Ice Age may have passed, but its lesson endures in every generation. We build not because the world is kind, but because it isn't. We create warmth not because we are weak, but because we dare to imagine comfort where nature offers none. It is the same instinct that led our ancestors to light a fire in a cave, that drives us now to light stars of electricity across our skies. Imagine for a moment those first humans huddled around a flickering flame, the air thick with smoke and breath, their eyes reflecting the golden dance of fire. They didn't yet have words for innovation, for engineering, for civilization, but they felt something stir, a quiet understanding that they could shape their world. In that moment, humanity was reborn. That spark, that belief, never died. It glows still in our cities, in our stories, in the rhythm of progress that hums beneath every human creation. Each time we design, adapt, or dream, we are answering the same ancient call that once echoed across the frozen plains. Perhaps that is the real legacy of the Ice Age, not the glaciers or the fossils it left behind, but the mindset it forged. The knowledge that survival is not about enduring the world as it is, but imagining what it could become. So when we speak of cavemen and their cozy homes, we're not talking about primitive people lost in time. We're talking about visionaries, the first architects of warmth, the first scientists of survival. They didn't conquer nature with weapons or words, but with creativity, with patience, with fire. And maybe that's the most profound truth of all. The warmth they created still burns in us. It's in the way we gather around our screens to learn, to connect. It's in the homes we build, the art we make, the dreams we chase despite the coldness of the unknown. That same determination, that refusal to yield, is the inheritance they left us. The Ice Age ended tens of thousands of years ago, but humanity's true fire, the one that started in a frozen cave, has never gone out. It only learned to burn brighter.